Hello everyone and welcome to the week 7 and 8 online modules. This is the first part, which is week 7. We're going to talk this week about the implementation of research for sustainable practice, and particularly using the example of changing age stereotypes. And this is important because one day we will all be old. Some of us it'll be sooner than others, but one day it comes to us all. It's not necessarily a bad thing. Like you to share with you, this is a picture of Kane Tanaka, who's a Japanese woman, who's the oldest recorded person. Just amazing. Okay, so these are the learning outcomes for the 2 weeks. So to understand the processes we're looking at, to understand the logic model and how to use it, and also importantly, how to use the query implementation roadmap to develop solutions for a problem that can be applied at different levels as prevention, intervention, and therapeutic strategies. So what I'm going to do in this brief overview is to go through the slides so that you can do the readings and think about them yourselves. So this is just, as I said, just an overview. The plan of attack hopefully is going to be, of course it won't be, this is how it's going to be done. This week is about the background to the problem and the processes of pre-implementation. And week 8 then will be about implementation and sustaining that intervention, and also as a recap of what we've done. So these are the readings and resources for this week. There may be some more that come out that you find yourself or that I've listed, but really to set the background for what we're planning to do. So there we go. Okay, so implementation science. So why is this important? You're doing a lot of stats about good research design and method, but this is where it goes afterwards. So all of that thoughtful and clever research, why doesn't anybody use it? So it's important that we think about how we put that into practice, how we turn that good research into something useful. And as scientist practitioners, you in your working lives are going to do this all the time. Be keeping up with the literature and going, oh, that could be interesting. How do you do it? How is it best done? So appropriate frameworks, identifying gaps, having a problem, implementation science. Okay, so this comes from the first of the readings, the Query Implementation Roadmap, and this is a really excellent document. It comes from the US Department of Veterans Affairs. It's designed so that veterans are treated with the best possible evidence-based practice. So what they've done is they've gone through and talked about how, from data to knowledge, knowledge to performance, performance to data, how we use that as a circular process that that frames our ongoing best efforts. So you can see then what's involved: pre-implementation, implementation, and sustainment phases. So have a look at that. The problem, what is our problem? So we have an aging population, which is not a bad thing. As someone who's slightly older, it's pretty good actually. It's nice being older. It means I'm not dead. Anyway, so why do we have an aging population? So people do live longer, reduced mortality at all ages. So children don't die. Women don't die in childbirth. Children don't die under 5. Young men don't die in wars. We don't die of dysentery and cholera, malnourishment. So we have fewer children because we don't need a lot of children to ensure we only get 2 to adulthood. Better physical health, all of those sorts of things. So the problem we have is, the good problem is that we're going to have more older people, might be more wise people, but aren't they going to be a burden on resource for our societies? And if you think they are going to be a burden, how can we reduce that burden? Very, very important. So before we come to looking at this problem, I want you to think very carefully about about the problem of age, as well as your own attitudes to aging. So, and think about what is old. Is old a state of mind? Is it only, old people are inflexible? I don't know. What do you think about your own aging? Are you, uh, how do you see the future? So, and is old only frailty, incontinence, and dementia? So, what are the other possibilities? So, no, it's not only those downsides, and yes, of course, there are possibilities. So, thinking about that developmental science, developmental psychology area, about how that informs us about older adulthood. So, Rowan Kahn's work on successful aging, Erickson's eighth stage, Baltus's work on selection optimization with compensation. And there are others that can be applied to that too, about how we understand what the best of older adulthood can be. Particularly, we're going to talk about Levi's stereotype embodiment theory when we talk about self-perceptions of aging. So we'll come to that. Why should we care about this? Well, as I said, we're all going to get there one day, and the ageism we see in the two infographics is that the ageism people experience compared to how they see themselves, how actually older people think about being old. It's not as bad as we thought, and and that ageist attitude. It's as nasty to say "okay, boomer," like old people, as opposed to say oh, snowflakes. So both are as bad. How do we have less of both? And why should we care about this? Because if you are mocking your future self, if you're saying, okay, boomer, you're mocking your future self. And it is, look, it is funny because it's just all like but what do you internalize in that process? And this is the problem, and this is why it becomes an important problem to solve, is that um, the internalization of old age is worthless. It's a really dangerous thing because it has consequences. Levi's stereotype embodiment theory talks about the internalization and enactment of those cultural stereotypes through psychological, behavioral, and physiological pathways into is what you think you will be is what you will do and what you get. So if we're talking about we have a problem and we think there's problem, how are we going to get from problems to solutions? So if we think that all oldies are going to be ill, um, then the solution should lead to better physical and mental health and independence of older adults. Because let's face it, if they live in their own homes, then you don't have the problems of how do you provide an aged care system that's not so demeaning. Um, and then it's sort of like we want them to be independent and well. And so, well, as possible. So what types of solutions would that involve? So, and how do we, in the end, get to the point where olders are happy to be old, and young people are not afraid of the later years, that this is going to be bleak and boring and diminished. So, so the solution we're trying to get at here is we're going to focus on changing age stereotypes to increase the individual's self-perceptions of aging. Now, why, I can hear you ask, why should that be so? So, SET proposes there are four core components that aging stereotypes begin in childhood, operate unconsciously, become more salient with age, and act through multiple pathways. And as you can see, the pathways are psychological, behavioural, physiological. So older adults embody their internalised view of aging, either embracing it or dreading it. And so it's sort of like what happens when you see the first grey hair, you go, oh, goody, I'm old, yay, or go, oh, I'm old. So it's a really important thing because it says, as we know with any sort of stereotypes, what you see is what you get. It's your heuristics about life. So what are the consequences of this? And yes, this is my article. Two of my students, Colleen Tully-Wilson and Richard Bojack, along with my academic colleagues, we did a systematic review of self-perceptions of aging. So that included 21 studies, longitudinal studies that lasted more than 12 months. They used the attitudes towards own aging, ATOA scale, 5 items. Participants were 50 plus years and older. So we used ATOA because it's so much better than felt age, because felt age depends on the day. And the newer models of demands and resources of aging, because that hasn't been in a great deal of research as yet. Across all of those 21 studies in 5 different countries is that there are no downsides for aging. It's okay, better physical health, greater longevity, better mental health, improved functioning. And I thought this is really good, reduced incidence of Alzheimer's disease. So that was through the health and retirement study. Even for people who have the APOE4 gene, which means you're much more likely to get dementia. So if positive self-perceptions are beneficial, can we have more of it? And if ATOI is a brief screener, can we use that for changing attitudes? So before we start, I went to finish up this first part of, almost finish up the first part then of the background, is that what do you think aging will be like for you? I want you to think carefully about your own views on aging and where you see it's going to be. It sort of mightn't be wholly negative, it mightn't be wholly positive, but in terms of framing this research, you need to think very carefully about, well, what does it actually mean for me? What does it mean for me? Who are the younger, sort of like, who are your role models of aging? What age stereotypes have you seen? Who are the older adults and how are they going with aging? Because some might be grumpy, some might be positive. So do we want more of the positive ones and less of the negative ones? Quite possible. So think about that, because as with any practice, you need to know where you come from. You need to know where your stands are. What are your beliefs and values about aging? Because then, it allows you to be more open and honest about what you're going to do. Because if you're scared of aging and you don't acknowledge it, then how's that going to help? Okay, last part here, I promise, Rosalie. Well, maybe the last part. So what I want you to do is measure your own self-perceptions of aging. So we've primed you now, we've thought about aging, we've thought about our role models, the people we know, but all those sorts of things. Now, imagine you are in your later years and you're now old yourself. With that in mind, answer the attitudes towards own aging questions as though you feel to that your aged self. So scan the code, answer the questions. So it is anonymous. I actually have no idea who answers it, but it's going to ask you those questions: how old you thought you were when you answered the questions, your current age, and a few bits and pieces. So away you go with that one. Okay, now we're thinking about the last part before we get into the I think fairly sure it is anyway. Primary, secondary and tertiary public health messages to make a difference. So primary is really that prevention strategies. Think about population-wide. We want to prevent the problem occurring in the first place. Interventions are, now people are at that age, how are we going to go? Therapies, of course, are one-to-one, that therapeutic outcome. Someone who is then has that disease or illness or condition. Tully Wilson et al. Proposed these prevention, intervention and therapies for using ATOA, thinking about how we change self-perceptions of aging to be more positive. What I want you to think in this activity is, are these the only possible solutions? What others could be proposed? Would we have differences, particularly in the prevention stage, between younger and older adults? Think about that. Okay, now we're up to the pre-implementation stuff. So So we've thought about the background. We've got a few possible solutions. We're now at that identify a problem. We're in that identify a problem and a solution phase. Then about thinking about what exactly, what is the current practice? Crickets, yes, exactly. What might be the barriers to changing it? So what's out there in social media land? Not good, that's for sure. Effective practices. So if we're going to think about solutions, and we're going to take previous research then, practice fidelity. So do we repeat what's in the research, or we're looking for something that's going to fit in a local context or fit our particular thing? So thinking about those sorts of issues. Because we're trying to look at how now what we're going to do about thinking about sort of we're starting to look at all those factors. Then intercultural and indigenous psychology. How do we, how culturally tailored adaptations? You might think about how do we show respect to those different groups and understand the way that aging is experienced in those groups and what are the stereotypes. So the activity here is to think about what are those cultural stereotypes of aging and what we might do to respect them and to make the most of them. Okay, next, so we've got number one, now we're down, engaging stakeholders. So we need to think about who's going to do this, who are the people, who are our internal and external stakeholders that, because it's not just us as academics who are going to do it, it's like real people, like people out there in the big wide world. So what might be the difference between internal and external stakeholders? So who are the groups of older people? So University of the Third Age, really important. Seniors Australia, I don't know, retirement villages. Where do we find older people that we can interact with them? What about the AMA, state and federal governments, professional associations for psychology, nursing, OT? Where might we say? Do you think we should include retirement villages? What about retail settings? What about employer groups? So rather than sort of going, oh, you're 50, you're way too old for a job, it's like going, oh, thank God, an older person. So think about those, a list of internal and external stakeholders who are interested in the physical and good and mental health of older adults, because you might think, okay, well, perhaps where we need to attack ageist stereotypes is in the workplace. And so we need to think about the delight of multi-generational teams and the strength of that sort of all of that sort of thing. So how could we do that? How could we confront those ageist stereotypes? So pages 22, 23 to 27. So the systematic approach goes through all of these different steps, assessing gaps, identifying effective practice solutions. So the query, as it's set out, it is about medical models, but the steps are the same. So how much you apply that to attitudinal change, behavioural change, that sort of thing. So map out and analyse behaviour steps, processes, decision points, barriers, facilitators, theory. Oh, well, blow me down. You need a theory too. Theory to link barriers, evidence-based change, designing and implementation using a logic model. And this is a really powerful thing. So logic models really allow you to sort of make sure you cover all your bases, but you don't go off track. So it's sort of like it allows you to sort of say, this is the purple mission. This is the mission of our practice. This is what we want to do. Oh, that's interesting, but it's not part of what we want. So you see that the generic model and then this first one here, which is, I seem to have lost the figure number, but you'll see it's there, 26, 27. And then when we look at in this activity here, is to think about um, what do we need at each stage. So what do we need as inputs, activities, outputs? What will we need for, what we'll need to see then changes in the changes short term, intermediate and long term. So how do they go together? Uh, so, and do they differ? Prevention, intervention, therapy differ with pathways that embodies stereotypes. Now that you've done, you've thought about those because you're going to go off and do this for me, aren't you? Uh, you're going to think about that logic model. And okay, so we've set out what we think we should be doing, what we want to see. Now the next step is how are we going to measure change? Because it's all very well to do that, but if you don't measure change, what is the point? Exactly. And we've done a lot in research design and methods that is about choosing, when we think about outcomes, well, what is your DV? What do you want to see changing? So how are we going to measure that? How are we going to operationalize that change that we want? So this is page 29 to 40. That will take you through so evaluation outcomes. So you can see then that this is figure 10. And it does also talk in there. One of the most common ones you'll see in terms of implementation science and the evaluation of any sort of program is that what is the reach? What is the effectiveness? How widely has it been adopted? How well was it implemented? Has it actually been maintained? Once we all back off and stop doing this, do people actually do this themselves? And ultimately, what we want is something that is self-maintaining. Okay, so this is an example then, a bigger example, sort of, so 12 and 13, evaluation domains using the logic model. So having used the logic model to set it up, now we're using the logic model to make sure we measure everything that we want to see. So, sort of, how do we know, for example, our inputs are how do you measure inputs, activities, outputs, all of those outcomes? What's the long-term population, impact on the population? So you can see the value of the logic model to really make sure that everything you are doing, like you've got all the bits and pieces together. So this is the next activity. You'll see this on the activity sheets. Between there is the two of these. Uh, there's there's the plan for what you're going to do, and then how you're going to measure the plan and the to evaluate the effectiveness of it, because there's no point in doing it if you don't know what it is, because of course you need to so I'll leave you to that. So of course is that you need to measure the baseline. You need to know where you started, because if you say, oh, this program's so effective, well, compared to what? Because people said they feel better? I don't think so. So the other thing I find really useful in terms of the query notebook, of course, is the implementation guide, is that it does at the end of each section say, here's a checklist. So did you do that? Have you identified a high priority need and the goals? Agreed on effective practices? Clarified your effective practice core elements? Engaged your stakeholders so that they have skin in the game and will do it? Have you designed the measures? So what I want you to do, so this is an overview of what I want you to do this week. So think about, work through the activity sheets, do the readings, think about what aging means to you and why it's important to change it, because I hope all of you one day will be really, really old and go, this is pretty good actually. She didn't tell Porkies. It's we need more life in our years, so it's very important. Okay, all the best with all of that. We shall touch base during the week and share all our ideas and synthesize it in the future. Enjoy.